Chapter 3. The Training Ground. Xander squared his shoulders, sweat dripping from his brow as he faced Master Yin across the training ground. The thin sword in his hand felt heavier with each passing moment. His breath came hard and fast, his chest rising and falling beneath the ash-gray Zenoan tunic he now wore. Master Yin stood motionless, the faint glow of a sapphire crystal hanging from her neck, catching the sunlight. The crystal pulsed faintly as if alive, and Yin's posture was calm, almost detached. "Feel it," Yin said, her tone low but clear. "The world moves around you. You must move with it, not against it." Xander tried to focus, gripping the hilt tighter and scanning for any hint of movement from his opponent. His body screamed for rest, but his mind replayed the same thought over and over. If I can't do this, how can I ever face the dark beasts? It had been over a week now since Xander appeared in this world. He wasn't sure how he felt about the whole prophecy stuff, but the princess was right, he needed the crystal. It was the only way he could make it back to his world, and to hunt down the crystal, he needed to learn how to protect himself in this world. So, he'd been training ever since. Oddly enough, there was something about this world he liked. It didn't feel foreign to him, and he didn't feel like an outsider. Sure, he missed his own world and his family, but Zenoan Prime had something that made him feel like he belonged. He had fair progress with the other masters, Rel and Lotus. Master Rel taught him about the Zenoan fighting stances and skills, which he picked up on quickly, even besting the man in combat once. Xander had always had an edge for unarmed combat. Master Lotus, on the other hand, had taught him sword fighting, a skill he had lacked in, unlike other martial arts. It had taken him a little while, but he had picked up on that quickly too. He was yet to best Master Lotus herself in combat, but he could hold his ground pretty well against her in a fight. And then there was his biggest problem, Master Yin. She was a tall woman who had long black hair streaked with silver that framed her gentle face, and wore an ash-gray tunic like Xander. She was supposed to help Xander defend himself against crystal users and, eventually, attune to a crystal himself. But she spoke little and seemed to enjoy beating the shit out of him. The wind shifted suddenly, and before Xander could react, Yin was on him, a blur of motion, a fist striking out faster than his eyes could track, and the next moment Xander was on his back, a dull ache radiating from his jaw. Groaning, he spat to the side and rolled onto his knees. "Another hit," he muttered, wiping the sweat from his face. The thin sword clattered beside him as he reached for it, forcing himself back to his feet. It was impossible to fight a crystal user, let alone one as attuned as Yin, whose sapphire gave her impossible speed and grace. Yin always moved like a bird in the wind, or perhaps the very breeze itself. He couldn't track her movements and always got hit. Gritting his teeth, Xander raised his sword again, keeping a focused expression despite the bruises forming beneath his tunic. Yin gave a faint nod, and they resumed. A good distance away, on a shaded balcony overlooking the training ground, King Raylan and Queen Mira of Zenoan Prime observed in silence. The king, tall and imposing with short black hair graying at the sides and a neatly trimmed beard, wore a gilded cape that shimmered faintly in the sunlight. Beside him, Queen Mira, with her long silver hair and serene violet eyes, stood with quiet grace, her expression calm but unreadable. Layla was almost an exact copy of her mother, but she had her father's stubbornness buried within those eyes of hers. Layla stood nearby, her posture stiff, as she watched Xander fall to the ground yet again. She was flanked by Master Rel, Master Lotus, and Kelzon, all of whom bore their own reactions to the scene unfolding a distance from them. The king chuckled, his deep voice rumbling. "This is the savior you brought before me, Layla?" he asked in disbelief. "He spends more time on his back than on his feet." Layla's jaw tightened, though she tried to keep her frustration in check. "Father," she said, carefully, "he needs time." The king laughed openly now, folding his arms. "Time? He can't even land a single blow on Yin, let alone survive a real fight. And this is the one who's meant to save us?" He shook his head. "Tell me, how exactly is he going to cleanse the darkness from this world?" Layla clenched her fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. Her father's words stung, but she refused to let it show. "Give him a chance," she said evenly. "You've only seen him for a day." Master Rel, standing beside her, let out a deep grunt before speaking. "With respect, Your Majesty, the boy may be struggling with crystal attuning, but he's impressive with everything else. I've trained warriors for years, and I've never seen anyone learn Xandonian martial arts as fast or as skillfully as he has." Rel's voice softened, a hint of approval creeping into his tone as he watched Xander hit the ground again. He just needs more time. But King Raylan shook his head, unimpressed. "Time is something we don't have. The kingdom needs a savior now, not a liability." His expression hardened. "I'm not entrusting the fate of Xandonian Prime to someone who can't even hold his own in training." He turned abruptly, his gilded cape swishing as he strode away, and his guards following closely behind. Layla's eyes darted to her mother, her last hope for support. Queen Mira gave a tight smile. "Trust your father's judgment, daughter," she said softly before turning to follow the king. For a moment, Layla stood frozen, her gaze fixed on the retreating forms of her parents. Slowly, she turned back to the training ground, watching as Xander rose again to face Master Yin. Despite her father's dismissal, there was no doubt in her mind. Xander wasn't ready yet, but she believed he could become exactly what they needed. Still, what her father had said got to her. Somehow, Xander would have to prove himself, and soon. The night was quiet, except for the faint rustling of the camp. Xander sat on the edge of a narrow cot in his tent, a standard soldier's quarters far less comfortable than the grand one he'd been given before. The fabric walls fluttered gently in the cool breeze. The faint glow of distant lanterns seeped in, casting flickering shadows. It was times like this he had missed Earth, and the comforts of technology in his family. But there was no use brooding over all that. He focused on the task at hand. He was shirtless, his lean but well-defined frame bearing the marks of the endless training he'd been put through. Bruises darkening at his sides, faint scars tracing his back, and fresh welts on his arms. Now his left arm throbbed and he wrapped a bandage around it carefully, wincing slightly with each pull. Master Yin had surely taken her sweet time tossing him around like a rag doll the past few days. On the cot beside him lay 3 small crystals, each dull and lifeless. He picked one up, turning it over in his hand as his mind wandered to Master Yin's words from earlier that day. "The crystal chooses the warrior, not the other way around." Her voice had been calm as she explained the process, the way the Xandonians spent their lives not just using a crystal, but unlocking every ounce of its potential. Xander huffed and set the crystal back down, rubbing his sore arm. He was supposed to feel something from one of them eventually. These were the most common types that most people attuned with. If the crystal didn't pick him in a week, Yin would provide another set of crystals for him to hold on to. So far, all he'd felt from these things was frustration. He was supposed to keep the crystals on him until one resonated. When it did, he'd spend a week trying to attune to it. But for now, the crystals remained inert. He hated it. He needed to be able to do this before he could even dream of finding the crystal that would lead him home. Scooping them up, and with a light cuss on his lips, he shoved them into his pocket. The flap of his tent rustled suddenly, and Xander looked up to see Kelzon step inside. He was sweaty, his ash-gray tunic stained with blood at the edges, his pants streaked with grime. His blue eyes flashed around Xander's tent with barely concealed irritation. Xander knew about the hunt earlier in the evening. A group of soldiers had gone after a dark beast spotted near the camp's perimeter, and Kelzon, of course, had been among them. Xander raised an eyebrow as he leaned back slightly. "So," he asked, keeping his tone light and even trying to offer a smile, "did you win?" Kelzon snorted and spat on the ground just inside the tent. "We lost 7 men, he said bitterly. 7 dead for what? The thing got away." His lips twisted into a sneer as he turned his gaze to Xander. "You do us all a favor and go tell the king you're a fraud." Xander's brow furrowed as he stared back at Kelzon. "I'm not a fraud," he replied flatly. He was used to Kelzon's jabs now, and he tried his best to ignore it. "And I never claimed to be your savior. Whatever mess you're dealing with here, it's none of my concern." That response seemed to strike a nerve. Kelzon stepped closer, his fists clenched at his sides. "None of your concern," he repeated, his voice rising. "You're standing in our camp, taking our food, wasting our training, all because she," he jabbed a finger toward the general direction of Princess Layla's tent, "thinks you're the one from the prophecy." Xander didn't flinch, though his muscles tensed. "I never asked for any of this," he shot back. "I just want to find the crystal and go home." Kelzon let out a humorless laugh. "Home? Do you even realize how many people have died while you stumble around, trying to figure out how to use a damn crystal? How many more are going to die before we stop wasting time on you?" "Back off," Xander warned, his tone low. He rose from the cot, standing a head taller than Kelzon. The man met his gaze in response. "Or what?" Kelzon goaded, taking another step forward. "You'll fight me? You can't even handle Yin, and she's holding back." Xander's fist tightened. "You've got no idea what I'm capable of." Kelzon laughed again, stepping closer until they were nearly chest to chest. "Then show me," he said, his voice a growl. "Prove you're not the fraud I think you are." The air between them felt heavy and tense. Xander knew he should walk away, but Kelzon's words burned. This man, with his arrogance, wasn't going to stop until Xander stood his ground. Without a word, Xander shifted into a fighting stance, his weight balanced, his fists raised. Kelzon's grin faded into a frown. "Pick up your sword," he said sharply, jerking his head toward the tent's opening. "We're doing this outside." Xander's jaw tightened, his teeth grinding against each other. He didn't want to do this. He knew Kelzon was just picking a fight out of frustration of what happened with the Dark Beast. And frankly, Xander didn't want to fight Kelzon, or waste his energy on something so pointless. Moreover, his arms were still sore from practice. "I don't have time for..." Kelzon cut him off with a sharp punch to the side of his jaw. It wasn't his full strength, but it was enough to make Xander stumble back a step. "No more excuses," Kelzon growled. "Prove you're worth something, or admit you're not." With a low growl of his own, Xander snatched his sword and stalked outside. The cool night air hit his bare skin as he stepped into the open. Soldiers milling about the camp paused to watch curiously. "Fine," Xander muttered, gripping the hilt of his blade. "But I didn't come here to fight you, and I don't want to..." Kelzon didn't wait for him to finish. He lunged forward like an animal, the red crystal hanging from his neck flaring to life. In the blink of an eye, he closed the distance and swung his blade. Xander barely parried in time, their swords clanging loudly and sending sparks into the night. The impact of blade against blade vibrated through his hand. Kelzon pressed his advantage, the glow of his crystal intensifying. With a sudden burst of power, he broke the contact and leaped backward, disappearing from Xander's immediate range, only to reappear behind him with a thrust of his sword aimed at Xander's side. Xander ducked and rolled away, narrowly avoiding the strike. "Fucking crystals!" Xander cursed as he squared his gaze upon Kelzon, who had a clear advantage with that enhanced speed and agility of his. He discarded his sword, tossing it to one side with a clang. If he wanted to win this fight, he would do it on his own terms. He waited only a moment before Kelzon did the same. He grinned darkly. With a sharp cry, Xander went on the offense in a mix of fluid movements, combining the martial arts of his world with the techniques Master Rel had taught him. His fists connected in rapid strikes, each blow calculated to force Kelzon onto the defensive. For a moment he thought he had the upper hand, until Kelzon's crystal pulsed again. The next hit was devastating. Kelzon leaped high, crashing down with a heavy kick that Xander managed to block with his raised arms, only to be sent skidding back. He was sure that he felt something crack in his hand, causing him to let out a small grunt. Kelzon didn't give Xander a chance to recover. With the power of his crystal surging in him, he leaped forward, covering the distance between them in moments, and threw a series of punches straight at Xander. It felt like being hit with a sledgehammer, and as one hit Xander's ribs, he heard the sickening crunch of bone. This time Xander let out a scream, but managed to shift back in defense. He was too late, though. From his blind side, one punch landed squarely on Xander's chest, sending him flying into a nearby tent, tearing through its fabric as he tumbled to the ground. A crowd had begun to gather, soldiers murmuring as they watched the fight unfold. Among them was Layla, sprinting toward the scene, her violet eyes wide with alarm. Xander lay on his back inside the collapsed tent, groaning in pain. His ribs ached, his limbs felt heavy. For a moment, he was tempted to give in, to stay down and let it be over. He let out a breath, staring at the night sky and the two moons within. One of the moons was now significantly smaller than the other, unlike the first time he'd come. And he felt something, an ember sparking to life deep within him, small at first but quickly growing. It felt like something was unraveling in his chest. His pocket felt warm, and his hand went instinctively to it. He pulled out the crystals and froze as he stared at them. All three were glowing, their dull surfaces pulsating with a brilliant energy. Hadn't Master Yin said a person could make use of only one crystal? But this was three. Slowly they floated out of his palm, hovering just above his hand. Gasps and curses traveled around, but Xander's attention didn't shift from the crystals. The first crystal, a dark obsidian, filled him with raw strength, making his muscles burn with power and leaving his pain forgotten. The second, a gleaming silver stone, heightened his reflexes and senses until the world became sharp and vivid. You could hear the faintest sounds, Kelzon's breathing, the rustle of the wind, even the soft plop of sweat falling from Kelzon's brow to the ground. The last was a sapphire, just like the one Master Yin made use of, its energy coursing through him in a way that made him feel light as air. He was sure if he took a step now, it would be impossibly fast like Yin. Xander's lips curved into a slow smile. The first time he felt in control. Clenching his hand into a fist, he rose to his feet. Power radiated from him as he turned to face Kelzon. The power seemed to pulse alongside with his heartbeat. One breath, two breaths. The power pulsed, begging to be set loose, begging for him to move and attack. Kelzon took a step back as he narrowed his gaze at Xander's fist, where the crystals laid. Xander smiled. His instincts screamed at him to prepare for an attack and teach Kelzon a lesson right now. But before Xander could move, a figure darted between them. "Stop!" Layla shouted, sprinting quickly into Xander's path, her hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Xander, stand down!" Xander hesitated, his fist still clenched, energy crackling around him. His focus shifted to her face. Her fierce violet eyes softened and pled with him. Layla turned to Kelzon, her expression fierce. "Kelzon, that's enough. You've made your point." Kelzon exhaled shakily, the tension in his body released as his crystal stopped pulsing. For all his bravado, the sight of Xander with 3 active crystals had rattled him. He spat on the ground, casting a final glare at Xander before turning on his heel and walking away, muttering under his breath. The small crowd began to disperse, though their curiosity lingered in their hushed conversations. Only then did Xander relax, his energy fading. The crystals dimmed, their glow extinguishing as they fell back into his palm. Exhaustion and pain hit him like a tidal wave, and he dropped to his knees before collapsing to the ground entirely. Darkness crept in at the edges of his vision as he heard Layla calling his name. Then everything went black.